scoff and make mockery of the religious articles on display. In spite of this official attitude and the continuing efforts to kill religion, it remains very much alive throughout Russia. A belief in God is instinctive in most men. The old bells still call the faithful to Mass after 50 years of harassment and programs aimed at extermination. Under the walks around the walls of the building, the early church leaders lie buried. According to the stories we were told, the bodies were placed under the walks to hide them from non-Christian invaders who sought to impose their beliefs on the Georgian. When the danger of discovery was past, the markers were installed. Most Soviet leaders believed when the old generation passed on, religion would die with them. But in spite of the anti-religion propaganda, the human instinct to acknowledge the existence of a supreme being is evidenced by the many young people who attend church services whenever and wherever they happen to be. The tree of life will probably still be worshiping God long after communism has passed on. Mount David is the highest peak of the ridge that dominates the Tbilisi skyline. On the summit of this mountain is a highly recommended restaurant serving native Georgian foods. On this particular day, I had wandered off by myself and met a young Georgian architect. He insisted on bringing me to the restaurant on this hill. He hailed a cab, and we rode over here from the other side of town. When I offered to pay for the cab and this ride on the cable car to the top, he flatly refused to let me pay. Fact is, he didn't pay either. Seems there is a common understanding between the citizens that beating the state out of its bite is a fair and popular game. No kopecks were spent that day by my friend or myself. Being born in Flat, Michigan, where only our spirits are high, dining in the open on the top of this mountain was a great thrill. The view of the city way below added to the enjoyment of the meal. 3 buddies of my friend Tamir spied him and insisted we join them. My friend spoke passable English, so we were able to communicate through him. Michael, whom you see now, is a doctor. Camel is an engineer and a dedicated and outspoken communist. David, too, is a doctor. He was deeply interested in America and asked many questions. Our waiter and my friends got a big charge when I offered a tip. This is Tamir. He makes my memories of Georgia very pleasant. Someday I hope I can see him again. This is one of 2 cable cars that serve the mountain restaurant. The fine food of the restaurant is the only attraction now. Stalin's statue on the summit once helped to draw the people, but it was removed when he was defamed. This old city has been under Russian domination since 1799. At that time, the Russians named it Tiflis, and by that name it was known until the very recent past. Out of deference to the native population who resented the Russian name, its Georgian name Tbilisi was reinstated. For many centuries, it has been the chief trading center on the historic route between Europe and Asia. This old town has endured the agony of pitiless invaders more times than can be remembered. Tbilisi is one of the oldest cities in the world. It was founded 400 years before Christ was born. Because of its great age, relics of the past abound in every section of the city and surrounding hills. Among the numerous ruins hereabouts, one is especially interesting. This antique, dating back 1,500 years, is known as Metaki Castle. It was originally built to serve as a palace for the Georgian kings and was used for this purpose for many hundreds of years. It has been idle and empty since the middle of the last century, when it was last used as a prison by the Tsars. Metaki Castle is crumbling and decaying, like so many other mementos of bygone eras that are so plentiful in this region of the Soviet Union. The authorities are aware of the potential these monuments have as tourist attractions, as demonstrated by the state's growing efforts to preserve these historic shrines. Standing high over a bend of the Kura River, the castle was in a good position to guard the city against invasion by water. It is situated on a peak with access by land from one side only, making it an easy haven to defend against the attacks of enemy raiders. 1,000 years ago, this was the center of life in Tbilisi. The king and his court, with all the pomp and ceremony of royalty, made this the action spot for the in crowd. The only visitors to Metaki Castle these days are the tourists. The natives of Tbilisi have little interest in the ancient ruins of past ages. Between visits, the caretaker with his animal companions has ample time and solitude to conjure dreams of the exciting, romantic, and glorious past of this former home of Georgia's kings. Early tomorrow morning, we leave Tbilisi for the next stop of our tour. As we enjoy a stroll before bedtime, the modern neon signs quickly erase Tbilisi's antiquity. Tonight, we discuss the type of plane we draw for tomorrow's flight, jet or prop. 100 miles as the jet flies. At Tashkent, we sat down only long enough to change planes and on to Samarkand. Here, for sure, the old and the new meet and mix. This old store is on a street where burro power and gasoline power vie for road space. Across the street, new apartments replace the substandard shacks that stood there less than 2 years ago. Even the luxury of TV is available. These shops are a far cry from the fabled markets and bazaars we expected and associate with this Asian oasis. But this is the Russian section of the city. The old Samarkand, the city that began when the Bible was being written, still exists. There are sections of this city of 200,000 where the people and their possessions are unchanged from the time history was first recorded. In 1865, Russia began its conquest of Central Asia and ended the centuries-old lethargy of these tradition-bound people. The Russian section boasts modern mass transportation, schools, industry, and even a college. There are the inevitable indoctrination programs for the very young, which is all to the good, considering the prospects of the children for education or even sustenance before the Russians came. History records the fact that in the year 329 BC, Alexander the Great laid waste to the Samarkand of that era. It follows that this city was in existence even before that time, which puts it in a class with Rome and Athens for great age. Today there are two Samarkands, the new, modern, growing city of the Russians, with the Arabs, Mongols, Jews, and Europeans who chose to break their bonds with the past, and the hoary city of antiquity. Changing century-old methods, habits, and dress is slow and difficult. A large segment of the population still use the donkey for transportation. They dress in the multi-layered robes of their forefathers, regardless of the 117-degree heat. But they are beginning to educate their children, are using modern medicine, and gradually accepting the miracles of the 20th century. On the very edge of this modern society, The Samarkand of Genghis Khan, Tamerlane, and Ulugh Beg still lives. Countless generations have been born, lived, and died in these mud huts that were built when this city, along with Bukhara to the west, were the twin jewels of the desert. The main trading market for the caravans arriving from Eastern Asia and from Europe to the west, inducing the poor and the ignorant to accept the benefits offered by the Soviet authorities has made slow progress in some areas. So long as humans live in shelters lacking heat, light, and ventilation, and not even fit for animals, appreciation for education and culture is hard to sell. So here too, housing has the highest priority. These hovels are being eradicated and replaced by the high-rise apartment. As new living space becomes available, the people living under the conditions of the Dark Ages are allocated space in the new buildings. Some, believe it or not, are reluctant to leave their wretched cells and are forcibly moved. But in a short time, the blessings of the new way of life convinces all of them, and then, and only then, can education and training begin so they may acquire the skills and the knowledge they will need to earn their bread and board. We are busing through bikes, cars, and trucks of the modern city to visit an old Muslim mausoleum in the ancient city. This is the entrance to the Shah-e-Zinda burial ground. Shah-e-Zinda meaning living king. Muslims still make periodic pilgrimages to these tombs to pay their respects to a holy man entombed here by the name of Qasim Abbas. It is believed he was the first man to bring the Islamic religion to Samarkand. All through the day, there are older Mohammedans keeping vigil near the temple. The faithful are sure Qasim watches over his flock from the tomb and will one day rise and return to his people. The descendants of the dead interred here are regular visitors too, and by their homage and prayers have transformed this cemetery into an unofficial shrine of worship. The entranceway, the domes, and tombs of this whole section was built in 1434 by a grandson of Tamerlane named Ulugh Beg. He was a very brilliant man who lived way ahead of his time. His astronomical discoveries and theories astound our sophisticated scientists to this day. Shah-e-Zinda is a series of tombs and monuments built on the side of a hill. Steep flights of stairs lead the pilgrims upward from one level to the next. This elderly gentleman was offered a ballpoint pen for posing for us, then demonstrated his ability to write with it. Along the Street of the Dead, tombs of the prominent and powerful people of an earlier era line both sides. The decorations on these buildings are considered to be among the best remaining examples of Islamic art. This portal of an unknown tomb offers a view of the so-called stalactite styling. It was used extensively during Tamerlane's time. The many beautiful plaques and the intricate designs of the mosaics would be a credit to a modern artisan. Considering the fact that they were done with crude tools entirely by hand, it is even more remarkable. These walls were laid over 500 years ago, still so well preserved, only a minimum of restoration work is necessary. After each expedition of conquest, Tamerlane would conscript the best craftsmen and artisans of conquered lands and force them to do his work. It does seem strange that the descendants of these gifted people lost the talent and the desire to add or even preserve these splendid monuments. Until the arrival of the Russians, no maintenance or restoration work was being done. However, the Soviets fully realize the treasure these medieval structures represent and have committed themselves to a program of complete research and restoration. These are believed to be the tombs of sisters of Tamerlane. Eventually, the scientists will open them and make a positive identification. Tamerlane, who was also known by the name of Timur, was a conqueror greater than the more publicized Genghis Khan. He was born in 1335 and died in 1405 at the age of 70. His empire extended from Europe to China. Samarkand was his home. There is a legend about his invasion of India. He returned with 90 captured elephants and used them in the construction of the many buildings he caused to have built during his reign. Stories written about him tell of a wound he received in battle and caused him to limp thereafter. Scientists opened Timur's tomb in 1941, and upon examination, the skeleton inside did indeed have a deformed hip. It proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the occupant of the tomb was none other than Tamerlane himself. The natives predicted a terrible curse would descend on the despoilers of the tomb's sanctity. Very soon after, Hitler began his invasion of Russia. Just a skip and a jump from the Shah-e-Zinda are a group of buildings called the Registan. We passed the local kvass tank, and while refreshing ourselves, caught this character enjoying the pause that refreshes. This fella is not an Uzbek, nor an Arab. He is probably a White Russian that went native. Dominating the Registan Square is the Ulugh Beg Madrasa. He began building it in 1405, and when completed, it was used to teach the students of Samarkand mathematics and astronomy. The square on which these buildings face was one of the most famous in the world during the lifetime of Tamerlane, and for many years after. Experienced world travelers are of the opinion that in all the world, only the Taj Mahal is more beautiful, even in their present state of decay. Everywhere you look, the attention given to the most minute detail is incredible. Each tiny piece of tile is the exact shape, size, and color to add its bit of harmony to the completed work. Patterns are in the wood and metal. Even the stone grills have a design of inlaid tiles. In an earlier day, this square was crowded with the citizens of Samarkand. This was the busy government and cultural center. Today, except for tourists and an occasional native family wandering through, it is alone with the spirits of the past. This is an Uzbek family. They are the predominant race in Samarkand, and of course, the state of Uzbekistan. It was the nomad Uzbeks who came to Samarkand in the early 16th century that caused the scattering of the Timur dynasty and its eventual downfall. Here, the intricate designs that cover the entire structure can be clearly seen. Restoring these masterpieces is a delicate operation. Qualified engineers must first determine how extensive the rebuilding must be. If the foundation is too poor to support the edifice, then the restoration must be from the bottom up. The palace of Tamerlane is almost a ruin. The dirt of the area surrounding it has been carefully screened, and every fallen piece of the original structure is salvaged and cataloged for reuse in the restoration. One day, all of these buildings will stand again in their original glory. For this tower of the Tilia Kari Mosque, that day is not far off. Samarkand is close to the center of a treeless, waterless plain, where the average rainfall may be as low as 3 inches a year. Without irrigation, a park with trees and flowers would be impossible. Nowhere in our travels were the people anything but friendly, and a camera in hand spoke a universal language. Almost at once, a local shutterbug appeared. An examination of each other's equipment was a prelude to a sign language conversation. These portals in the background is the entrance to a native Uzbek outdoor theater. That evening, we had a sample of what the Uzbeks consider entertainment and pay their good money to see. This is how it looked and sounded. This went a long way, but it was interesting. However, I don't believe they could last out a 39-week stint on American TV. On second thought, maybe they could. The next morning, I strolled back to the park, just to pass the time until our bus was ready to leave for the tour of the day. I did manage to get a close-up of the broom used by one of the ladies of the street. Notice the gum in her hand. She tried to return it to me after posing. She thought it was a prop I loaned her for the picture. This contraption was right under my hotel window. The whine of its propellers kept us awake until midnight when the park closed. Our tour will take us back to the old section of the city, which is okay because we can see sights like this anywhere. But not too often does one get an opportunity to climb to the balcony of an old Muslim minaret. There are 30 million Muslims living in the Soviet Union, most of them right here in Central Asia. Many no longer practice their religion, having succumbed to the anti-religious propaganda of their atheistic government. In these graves are the bodies of the true believers, the ones responsible for the beautiful mosques and temples built to honor and worship Allah. Nita, our tourist guide in Samarkand, is one of the new breed. She has nothing but contempt for the believers. She is a member of the communist cult. Her gods are in the Kremlin. Nita guides her brood to the observatory of Ulugh Beg. We made mention of him earlier, you recall. Tamerlane was his grandpappy, and after the death of the great Emir, the era of conquest ended. Ulugh Beg, who succeeded him, was a peace-loving man and a scholar. You are looking at the building that housed his sextant. It was erected in the early 1400s, and in 1908, the Russians excavated these ruins and began rebuilding. 500 years ago, Ulugh Beg observed and cataloged more than 1,000 stars. Our guide told us this grave contains a skeleton found in the ruins during the excavation. Once again, we shall leave the past and look at today in Samarkand. To me, the native markets of the various peoples of our world are at the top of the list for interest and color. Here is an area of the Soviet Union where the coming of the Russians has changed nothing. This market is just around the corner from Registan Square. At one time, its west end opened directly onto the square. This bazaar was going great guns when the Registan was a center of government. The market was unaffected by the changeover from one ruler to the next, nor was it affected by the shift from free enterprise to the communistic system. This is still a free market. The produce sold here was grown on the small plots of ground each citizen may use for himself. These small gardens are given intensive care, and the yield is more than double that grown on the same area of state farms. Sounds, sights, and smells. Those are the three elements that make a market so interesting. Every day of the week, hundreds of people come here to buy and sell the necessities of life, ranging from thread to bread. Thousands of sales are made each day, and not one of these sales are consummated without first indulging their love for bargaining. This cacophony of voices is the overwhelming sound of the market. The faces of people always entrance me. There is a friendly, benign look in these faces, and it makes one wonder about those stories of strife and warfare and fierce ancestors. The styles in clothing are interesting too. Usually, the older men and women are dressed in the traditional robes of their forefathers. Some look like it actually is their ancestors' robe. They make no concession to the 117-degree heat of the day. The younger, enlightened men and women were more sensibly dressed in light, airy garments, much like our own. Then there are the smells, the aroma of fresh baked bread, the pleasing fragrance of herbs and spices, of tea and coffee, the perfume of many flowers and fruits. While wafted through all of these pleasant smells is the stink of open sewers and overripe meat. I tell you, a deep draft of air of this market can be pretty heady stuff. Just a short walk from this market is Tamerlane's tomb. It is the only Timurid structure that is completely restored. Other members of the Emir's family are buried here also. One is Ulugh Beg, whose head was severed by a traitorous guard wielding a scimitar. When these tombs were opened, Ulugh Beg's head was, in truth, detached from the body. About 3 in the afternoon, we finished our last tour of Samarkand and returned to the hotel. The smell of roasting meat drew me to the rear of the building, where the cook's helper was barbecuing shashlik. I read 2 or 3 books on the areas of Russia we planned to visit before our departure, and I remembered the authors writing about the great delicacy of Central Asia, shashlik. That may be so, but I don't know. All the shashlik that I had, and I've had it at least once a day since Tbilisi, was tough, grisly, fat, burnt, and bad tasting. I don't even like good mutton, so once again I shall dine on the delicious, heavy white bread and tomatoes. My last recollection of Samarkand is this street poster of Lenin. I can't decide what significance to attach to the jackass walking past him. When you travel in Russia, Lenin is with you everywhere. The authorities have rejected the true God and try to replace him with Lenin. We arrived in Bukhara just in time for lunch. It was served on a patio beside the hotel. The cuisine is 100% Near East. Tomatoes are in season, and we've had them